Hello everyone. Today I thought in our coffee morning I might talk about being raised in the 1960s. And if you're a baby boomer brought up in England, you might relate to some of these tales or incidents that might have happened in your family too. Now, I was brought up in an army family, which meant we moved often. Of course, not many people had a TV in those days. In fact, I didn't know anybody who had a TV in those days. That said, we used to listen to the radio. And when we were living in Germany, my mother used to always serve our dinner up to two-way family favourites, which was on, I think, at about 1 o'clock on a Sunday. And I'd listen to that theme tune and then I would know that dinner was almost served. It was that well timed. And she was a great cook of a roast dinner. That was one thing. The other thing I can remember is because I'd always lived in army quarters and my grandmother lived in a council maisonette, I always thought that the people who lived in private houses, that they were buying, were obviously rich. And it wasn't until years later that I met one of these people that I used to play with when I was small. And I said, I always thought you were really rich, really wealthy. And they said, we really weren't, because my dad was so worried about paying the mortgage. Never thought of that. But they did have a nice house. The other thing was that in the 1960s, everybody used a milkman. We wouldn't buy milk from the supermarket in massive bottles. It would come delivered to your door in pint bottles made of glass. And if it was a hot day, normally you would put out one of those ice cream containers that were insulated so that it wouldn't get hot and spoil, but also so that the blue tits wouldn't peck through the tinfoil lids of the bottles and drink the cream. And that was a thing. They would do that. They would sit on the edge of the bottle and they would peck through and they would drink the cream. Clearly, they knew what they were doing. In those days, there wasn't anything such as semi-skimmed milk. It was milk. And because it had been sitting for a while, there was cream on top. And if you really liked a lot of cream in your milk, then you would pay for the gold top. You could have silver top, which was normal milk with a bit of cream, red top, which probably had less cream in it, and gold top, which had, it looked about 4 inches of cream on the top. And I think that's what my dad liked, because he used to drink it. You could hear the sound of that milk cart coming down the road because it clinked. And you'd know then that the milkman was coming. And our milkman used to have a horse that pulled his cart, but then eventually he got this little vehicle which was run by batteries. And when I was old enough, I think I was probably about 8 or 9, when I stayed at my grandmother's house, I would help him on his milk round because I was young and fit. And I'd run those milk bottles to and fro from people's doorsteps, and I loved it. And he would pay me about 6pence for my work, which was great. In the 1960s, doing the washing was usually on a Monday, and people would be judged by how white their whitewashing was. And I know that my grandmother and my mother both had a boiler, and they'd have that boiler going and they would wash all their sheets and nappies when I was little in the boiler and they would come up pristine white. And all of their whites were kept white. You didn't see ever, unless that lady didn't have a boiler, of course, washing on the line that was meant to be white that turned grey. It would be looked down upon. And also, how you hung your washing up. If you hung your washing out without any care or attention to how it looked, then you would be judged. I know to this day, when I did hang my washing out on the line, I would have a certain method of doing it, and my stepmother did too. And I once went on a cruise, and the Italian lady was saying, you see all these people with their washing hanging out of their buildings, that woman isn't a very good housekeeper because look at how her washing has been hung out. And I thought, gosh, they do it in this country too. People would judge women by how they hung their washing out, whether they hung it out carefully or they just slapdashed it onto the line and hoped for the best. I always thought that if you hung it out carefully, it would make a lot of difference when you came to ironing it. If you hung t-shirts up just by the pegs at the end, so the t-shirt hung down like that, then it was going to be all stretched out of shape, so I wouldn't do that. In those days, children didn't have a lot of toys, but we were allowed comics, and we did enjoy a comic. I can remember walking into the Nuffy on a Saturday with my money, and I would buy the Dandy, the Beano, and as I got a little older, I would buy the Bunty. I think the Bunty had the cut-out clothing and the doll on the back cover, and my friends and I would swap Bunties and cut those dolls out, and we would spend hours getting the little tabs over the little bodies and putting the dresses on. I can't imagine children finding that sufficient enough to play with. But in those days, we had so much imagination, and we really did enjoy those Bunty dressing up doll games. We let our imaginations run riot, and it was absolutely lovely. Did you have a favourite magazine, comic, when you were younger? If you're a baby boomer? I know we used to swap them. They were like treasured items because, frankly, you didn't have many toys, and those were great, especially if they involved your imagination. I can remember my grandmother giving me an empty chocolate box, and in that chocolate box I had a whole load of her pens that she used to take to bingo with her, and a whole load of betting slips because she did like to bet on horses, and I would make it an office, and I was an office worker because clearly I had pretensions of grandeur even then. So I would spend all day playing with that empty chocolate box with all the bits and pieces of paper and so on and so forth, and I thought it was wonderful. I can't imagine any child today wanting to play with an empty chocolate box filled with scraps of paper, can you? It just wouldn't happen. Do you remember in those days that if a household item broke, then you'd take it to get fixed? It wasn't the throwaway society that we have now. So often I have had a toaster that has stopped working properly, and try as you might, you can't find anyone to replace an element in it. You just have to buy a new one, which is, so wasteful. Drives me crackers that it has to go into landfill. You take your broken electrical item or your clock or your watch, well, you can get those fixed these days, but you can't get really a place that fixes electrical items. For example, a hairdryer. You just have to throw it away. A toaster, again, in the bin. all those small items. It is just ludicrous. Even your iron, and goodness knows, I go through a lot of irons because I do so much ironing. But surely some clever person with a talent for mending things could open a little place that you could get your things mended. And if there were enough of them, I'm sure a lot of people would do it, although things are so easily replaced. I don't know whether they would. Such a shame. When I was little, table manners were important. There were no elbows on the tables. My father used to say, all joints on the table will be carved. So you weren't allowed to sit with your elbows on the table. At boarding school, we weren't allowed to use our fork as a shovel. So in other words, you weren't allowed to have your fork up that way. You had to point it downwards, and you had to, even if you were eating peas, you would have to press your peas onto your fork and then transport them to your mouth. If you used it as a shovel, you would be called out about it. And the phrase, please use that implement in your hand as a fork, not a shovel, was often said to people, including me. The other thing you weren't allowed to do was eat with your mouth open. Now, I have to say, I really detest seeing the contents of somebody's mouth being chewed, a bit like a cow eating cud. There is nothing quite so off-putting as sitting opposite somebody who is chewing like this. I really detest it. I can't even eat my own dinner if I see somebody eating like that. I think it's disgusting. It looks horrible to see what they're eating, being churned over and over again. I don't even like it if they're eating gum like that. I think it's uncouth and looks ugly. Do you remember before we all had mobile phones, we would pick up the phone and we would say our telephone number, or we would say our name. And if you wanted to phone home, you would just dial the number and you had it in your head. If you had friends, they had telephones. Some obviously didn't. But if they did, then you'd remember it in your head. You had a head full of telephone numbers. Imagine this day and age when you have to phone somebody. If you don't have it programmed into your mobile, you won't remember their telephone number. Luckily, I do remember Katie's, and I do remember my darling boys, and obviously I know my own. But those are only 3 numbers, and I don't remember any other ones. That is shocking, isn't it? How we change as we get lazy at remembering. It really is a muscle that we should exercise more before we lose it. And do you remember going to the phone box because you didn't have a phone in your house? And in England, you'd go to one of those red phone boxes, you'd put your pennies on the side, or your sixpences, I think it was pennies actually, and you would press button A, put your money in, dial your number, and you would put your money into the phone, you would dial your number, and only at the point when somebody picked up the phone and you were connected to that number did you press button A. But if you hadn't used all the money that you put into the telephone, you could press button B and then get your change back, which was always quite handy. Perhaps you'd phoned the wrong number, you'd phone and you'd press button A and they say, no, sorry, wrong number. Well, if you put 4p in, then you'd think you'd lost it, but you'd press button B and all the rest of the money that you hadn't spent on that telephone call would be, I think I remember, it would be replaced and you get it back out of the telephone. And the last thing I remember was that we were a nation of queuers. We used to queue for everything. I can remember being in a queue And if somebody tried to jump in, they were looked down upon, and rightly so. We don't like somebody to push in and think they had the opportunity to skip the queue. In the 1970s, I can remember that there were so many opportunities to queue for everything. There was the 3-day week when the miners went on strike and people only went into work because the factories didn't have any power. That was the 3-day week. Also, that brought about with it blackouts in the evening when the lights would go off and they wouldn't come back on for hours and hours. And you sit there with a candle, just chatting. That was in the 70s. It really, I think it was called a winter of discontent. I can remember people queuing up for sugar. There was a sugar shortage. And then there was a bread strike. Can you imagine? And people were only allowed to have one loaf of bread. People were queuing up down the road for a loaf of bread. Do you remember those? It is quite astonishing, isn't it? How things have changed. If you remember anything about growing up in the 60s, do leave me a comment. I'd love to know what you remember, especially if you're in England and you remember some of the things that I remember. And in the meantime, thanks for watching. Lots of love. Bye-bye.